So let's talk about queerbaiting. The discussion online around queerbaiting over the last couple years has been increasingly unproductive and at times downright toxic. Denizens of the internet will and have called anything that annoys them queerbaiting. But these conversations are bad, not just because all conversations on the internet are bad, but because they're actually difficult to talk about. We don't really have the language developed to discuss these topics, and in particular, when it comes to the topic of real people queerbaiting, any discussion necessarily requires talking about the sexualities of real people. The last few months, with Bad Bunny kissing a man at the VMAs, Charlie Puth doing album promo, Harry Styles playing a closeted policeman, and Taylor Swift titling a song Lavender Haze, have really thrown these conversations into hyperdrive. But it's everything awful that has happened to and around Kit Connor that really puts the harms of these accusations into stark relief. This topic is incredibly difficult to talk about, and one that I've been wanting to talk about ever since Kit Connor left social media amid queerbaiting accusations back in September. But I couldn't think of a good way to do that without bringing further scrutiny and further speculation to Kit's sexuality. Unfortunately, that dam appears to have broken, and so now I have thoughts. Let's go back to April 2022, when Misha Collins came out in a lengthy Instagram post. To clarify, he came out as straight. He wrote, quote, "I need to correct the record. I am not bisexual. I happen to be straight, but I am also a fierce ally, and the last thing I want to do is falsely co-opt the struggles of the LGBTQIA+ community." This absolutely incredible Notes app apology came after Misha set Twitter ablaze, seemingly coming out as bisexual at a convention. This sounds like something that was maybe exaggerated by the internet gossip machine, because surely it's impossible for someone to accidentally come out as bisexual, right? Well, you would think so, but when you hear Misha Collins' words entirely unprompted, it's really hard to interpret them as anything else.
By a show of force, how many of you would consider yourselves introverts? How many extroverts? And how many bisexuals?
Don't forget the gay. Where'd that come from? We're the whole flag. Yeah, don't forget.
I'm all
Yo Hatikas. This extremely awkward throwaway line seems like the perfect candidate for a queerbaiting accusation. This is a self-identified straight man with a large fan base of queer fans who are interested in a queer relationship with his character, leveraging a faux queer identity in order to market himself. It doesn't get more textbook than that. But is this queerbaiting? What are the harms of queerbaiting? Can a real person do it? And maybe most importantly, how the hell do we talk about it? What is queerbaiting? Well, Misha Collins is the perfect catalyst for this discussion because he is born from Supernatural, or Queerbait Patient Zero. Imagine this. It's the early 2010s and you've migrated to Tumblr after Russia has nuked LiveJournal. Regardless of what fandom or niche you come from, your dashboard is full of gift sets of two white brunette men glancing at each other. It's unclear from the context of these gifs if these men are actually in the same scene together or if they've spoken a word to each other. The gifs are cropped so closely that you can see nothing but their face. Occasionally, one of them smiles, so you feel pretty certain that they are capable of feeling emotion, but far less certain whether they feel any towards each other. And yet, despite all this, the tags on these posts are invariably unhinged key smashes and sentence fragments expressing all the devotion that these fans have to the relationship between these two characters. So what's happening here? Mass delusion? Typical fandom exaggeration? I mean, yeah, both of those things are happening here. Absolutely. Slash fandom has a tendency to cling on to any potential gay relationship in its favorite media properties, regardless of the complete lack of support for it in the text. But also, these media properties, be it Supernatural or Teen Wolf or Sherlock, understood that their most fervent fan bases were interested in a queer relationship between their characters and would read queerness into subtext that was only there in the wonkiest of magic eye illusions. So they played into that, not in the text, but through extra textual means. Things like interviews and social media posts and press junkets.
Tyler.
Yeah.
Wake up.
No.
We're on a ship. Pun intended.
These fans were not delusional. They were being fully supported by the creators of the show, just not in the text. For example, Queerbaiting in Fandom, which as far as I can tell is the only textbook on queerbaiting, begins with a pretty illuminating anecdote. Quote, in response to a question about a potential romance between his character and one of the other male leads, he responded, "It's a funny thing because we really don't talk about it, but I do think we all pay lip service to it. For instance, this I should not be saying. There was a line in the last episode that I shot where his character says, 'I love you' to my character, and I'm 98% sure that that was in there for a reason. That line didn't make the final cut." This quote, which begins the only textbook on queerbaiting, is of course from Misha Collins. This type of baiting thrived in TV properties with slash fandoms in the early 2010s, giving rise to our modern definition of queerbaiting. From Queerbaiting in Fandom, that definition is an industry tactic where those officially associated with a media text court viewers interested in LGBTQ narratives without the text ever definitively confirming the non-heterosexuality of the relevant characters. Okay, so that's what queerbaiting is, but does that make queerbaiting bad? I mean, certainly everyone assumes it's bad, and it in fact is, but I think it's important to examine specifically why. What are the harms associated with queerbait? Let's start with the obvious. While properties that queerbait might hold themselves out as queer representation, they're not. While there's a whole host of implications that come from this, there are two really specific harms that I think are worth talking about. The first is it puts these queerbaiting properties into some pseudo competition with actual queer media. This, of course, dilutes and reduces the amount of actual queer representation that there is. Second, for those who take the bait, these queerbaiting properties can serve as inauthentic representation. When characters who are not written with queerness in mind are nevertheless taken as such, they can end up reinforcing and perpetuating really harmful stereotypes. Sure, textual queer characters can do this as well, but when it comes to queerbaiting characters, it's almost necessary, because fans will then seize on anything that seems stereotypically gay as proof that their favorite characters are queer. The exploitative coyness of queerbaiting also ends up playing into a handful of homophobic mindsets. First, it perpetuates the idea that queerness should stay in the shadows, in the dark. The idea that queerness is somehow embarrassing or shameful or illicit. That queerness is only okay so long as it is not actually lived. Second, it furthers the idea that queerness is a choice. In treating the sexuality of these characters as a game, it gives the impression that queerness is not an inherent part of their identities, but instead a costume that they can take on and off at a whim. And of course, there's just all the harms that come from the commodification of any identity. Taking money from queer people with no intention of living up to their end of the implied promise, taking opportunities away from actual queer people, and flattening queer culture into a commodity. These harms all have clear, concrete manifestations. It's really easy to see the connection between the idea that queerness is shameful to a don't say gay bill, or the idea that queerness is a choice to conversion therapy, or the perpetuating of stereotypes to the escalation of hate crimes and discrimination. But I think maybe the most widely felt harm is also the most intangible. And that's one just rooted in a sense of justice. The general idea that queerbaiting is unfair, that these straight properties are exploiting queerness to get ahead, that LGBTQ+ people not only cut, but broke their teeth for this, and it's simply not for others to use. These feelings and these senses of injustice represent real hurt and real felt legitimate harm. Obviously, the actions that may fit into the umbrella term of queerbaiting vary widely and will be harmful to greatly different degrees. Some may even be relatively benign. But I think it's pretty uncontroversial to say that queerbaiting is bad. So as a term, queerbaiting began as a reference to a marketing tactic for media properties. Now, what about real people? Certainly these days, the internet is rife with accusations accusing real people of queerbaiting. Everyone from Taylor Swift, Harry Styles, Bad Bunny, Charlie Puth, Billie Eilish. One of the most common responses to these accusations is that real people can't queerbait. And as we've just gone over, that's true. Queerbaiting is a term used for media properties, not for real people. And in topics as sensitive as sexuality and identity, it makes sense, and we should be very precise about the language we use. So no, real people cannot queerbait. But that doesn't end the conversation, because when real people can't queerbait is the entire response, that's a semantic response to an argument that's actually about the morality of actions and the appropriateness of the response to those actions. So when it's used to shut down a full conversation, it tends to ignore a lot of real hurt and genuine legitimate concern from LGBTQ plus people, which causes the discourse to devolve even further. And let's be clear, there is a lot of genuine hurt and frustration that these actions that we lump together as queerbaiting from celebrities can cause to LGBTQ plus people. To act like there is no underlying issue here seems willfully ignorant. Because what many people mean when they accuse a real person of queerbaiting is that a real person is adopting an inauthentic queerness to market themselves to a queer audience. And in that sense, yes, it is absolutely possible for a real person to do that, whatever we call it. To illustrate the issue with a purely semantic response that queerbaiting is the incorrect term, we could invent an entirely different term for that. For example, let's take another relatively recent term for identity appropriation and call it queer fishing. You know, when real non-Black people attempt to appropriate and exploit Blackness, we call it black fishing. Let's extend that concept to queerness and call it queer fishing. Great. Now when a celebrity does something we don't like, we can call it queer fishing every time, and that solves all of our problems, right? Of course not. We're in the same mess, the same gross discourse soup. It just now has a different name. The harms in this hypothetical situation of queer fishing are largely the same as when a media property queerbaits, reinforcing stereotypes, inauthentic representation, the commodification of queer culture, and perpetuating the notion that queerness is a choice. In some cases, those harms are even more acute. In particular, in a case where a real person is queerbaiting, that does more to perpetuate this idea that queerness is a choice or a game or a costume than a media property ever could. This is all a moot point if no real person actually queerfishes or queerbaits or whatever we call it. So does anyone actually do this? And well, as I do almost daily, let's turn to some guys on TikTok. A group of TikTok influencers, a term I use only in the absolute loosest of senses, made minor headlines last year. These were the Alpha House Boys. This was a group of guys who maintained two separate identities, one of which they posted sort of their normal run-of-the-mill internet content, jumping on viral memes, posting thirst traps, you know, really the most basic level TikTok stuff that you try to get out of your algorithm as soon as possible. On these accounts, they made either no reference to same-sex attraction or explicit references to opposite-sex attraction. But on their second accounts, which were not linked in any way to their first account, they posted exclusively gay content. And this content was filled with gay stereotypes and was hypersexualized. It was not just gay content in the sense of gay culture, but gay content seen as someone who only views gayness as a sexual preference. For these creators, being gay was not an identity, but an act of marketing. It's why their main usernames often were just their actual names or names, and their gay account usernames were things like Mask for Mask or Hung Mask. Can I say for certain whether these guys were gay or straight or somewhere in between? No, I cannot. But I do know they all had OnlyFans accounts that they were funneling their TikTok followers into to profit from. And I do know that once they were called out, they all deleted their accounts. And I do know that in every video, they were peddling harmful, reductive stereotypes about gay people. So certainly, whether they are gay or not, they were definitely performing an inauthentic gay identity to exploit queerness. Now granted, the Alpha House Boys aren't celebrities in the typical sense. And so maybe you think there's some difference between them and the celebrities we're talking about, like Harry Styles and Taylor Swift. And certainly there are a lot of differences in degree. But the point here should be fairly clear. Lots of real people are now marketing themselves to the world. And they are marketing their lives and their authenticity to profit. Some of these people are, like the Alpha House Boys, generously influencers. but some of them are celebrities. They are marketing themselves and presenting a very specific version of themselves to sell their identities to the public. Okay, so real people can queerfish or do something similar to queerbaiting, and it has many of the same harms as queerbaiting. So let's just call it the same thing and call it a day, right? Of course not. First, there's absolutely no consistency to what we accuse real people of queerbaiting for. Let's just go through a handful of examples from the last 2 months. Charlie Puth gets accused of queerbaiting for posting thirst traps while identifying as straight. Taylor Swift gets accused of queerbaiting for releasing a song titled Lavender Haze while maintaining explicitly that she is not part of the LGBTQ+ community. Harry Styles gets accused of queerbaiting for dressing in a gender non-conforming way while declining to publicly label his sexuality. Hell, Anthony Porosky and Jonathan Van Ness, two out queer men, were even accused of queerbaiting for teasing a fake relationship reveal to market their pet food products. All under the same umbrella. Second, and more to the point of why we can't just end the discussion at queerbaiting is bad, is that real people's sexualities are at stake. Because when most people answer, real people can't queerbait, they actually don't mean it as a purely semantic response either. What they're saying is, real people have actual sexualities and can actually be harmed by accusations of queerbaiting. Nothing we say or do or critique about Castiel is ever going to harm Castiel, because he's a fictional demon who's already been condemned to super hell for being gay. But we can harm real people when we accuse them of performing identities. And we cannot know what their actual sexuality or gender identity is until they've told us. As every LGBTQ+ person should know and should be well aware of, sexuality is hard and it's confusing and it's difficult and it can be fluid. It can be really hard to understand your own sexuality. The idea that a complete stranger could is absolutely absurd. And the harms to real people accused of queerbaiting are steep. We can alienate actual LGBTQ+ people from their own community by accusing them of not being gay, or not being gay enough, or not being gay in the right ways. Necessarily, these are people who are not out, and so may be less comfortable in their sexualities, or feel less safe in their communities. These sorts of accusations can be irreparably damaging to someone's sense of self and self-worth. And at the extreme end, real accusations of queerbaiting can force someone out before they are ready. These harms, of course, only exist if the person being accused is LGBTQ+. But as we can never know someone else's sexuality for certain, this is always a risk when we accuse someone else of queerbaiting. Is the answer then just to not call people out for queerbaiting, even if it can be actually harmful? And even if in situations where we accuse a straight person, risk of a harm is relatively low? And I think the answer is yes. Because two things can be true. An action can have the possibility of being morally wrong, and the appropriate response from you may just be to do nothing. Social media has made everyone feel empowered to be the ultimate universal arbiter of moral justice. But of course, morality is not absolute. And with the scope of people and issues that we come into contact with via social media, we often lack the context to be able to properly evaluate a situation. When that situation involves evaluating the sexualities of strangers, I promise you, we never have the context. That does not mean that LGBTQ+ people just have to shut up and deal with queerbaiting. Because when people do exploit and profit off of queerness in a way that harms queer people, we should do something about it. It just means we need to be careful with how we discuss those specific actions. And that's exactly what we should do. Discuss the specific actions and the specific harms that those actions cause. And not just decry queerbaiting and everything that we find annoying, as easy as that is. And hopefully this leads to productive conversations that do not necessarily require us to speculate about a stranger's sexuality. For example, as a pure hypothetical, let's say a musician takes a role as a gay law enforcement officer in a movie, and in doing press for that movie says something like, I don't know, I'm just spitballing here. Quote, so much of gay sex in films is just two guys going at it, and it kind of removes the tenderness from it. Then let's criticize that statement for what it is. Flat out inaccurate, reflective of a person with no understanding of the topic they're speaking about, and a product of deeply entrenched homophobic stereotypes that queerness itself is somehow explicit. Should such a statement happen, it's possible to criticize that statement and the person making it with no reference to their sexuality and without using the term queerbait. Of course, not all cases are this clean, but at least if we're careful about the language we use, we can try to make our discussions more productive. in that same example, let's say someone is genuinely hurt that that actor is taking the role of a queer character. It's possible here to say, I don't think that X should have taken that role because I think queer characters should only be played by out queer actors. You might disagree with that. In fact, I disagree with that statement, but at least it focuses the discussion on what the actual issue is. Now we can talk about how out LGBTQ plus actors have had historically fewer opportunities in Hollywood, about all the dangers and harms that come with coming out in Hollywood as an actor, and about whose responsibility it should be to ensure authentic representation on screen. Just reframing the way we talk about it doesn't actually solve these issues, but it makes sure that the discussion we're having is about these issues and not about the sexuality of the actor. That all said, neither of those examples gets to what is the most common type of behavior that gets accused of queerbaiting. And that's when a person who is not openly LGBTQ+, and maybe has been in or is in a cis-het presenting relationship, does something typically associated with queer culture or the queer community. Sometimes that's dressing in a way that defies gender norms, sometimes that's expressing an interest in Lady Gaga or Girl in Red, or sometimes it's waving a rainbow flag. But you'll notice if you try to criticize these actions and articulate an actual harm, you might start sounding a little silly. Something like, I don't think this man should be able to wear a dress because I don't think straight men should wear dresses? Not a great look, Bob. When we're forced to be actually specific with our criticisms, we can start to have more productive conversations and start to see where some of these queerbaiting accusations can feel a little thin. That said, I want to stress again that just because I don't think we necessarily should call some of these actions out as queerbaiting doesn't mean I do not think that there's genuine hurt felt when these actions happen. Because frankly, some straight people will and have attempted to perform a queer identity to profit from a queer audience. We just can't know for certain who those people are. So if you're an LGBTQ plus person who is frustrated by this, that's also totally within your right. It's a totally valid feeling, and I know one I feel all the time. But in those situations, I think the appropriate response is to vent to your group chat or unfollow that person on social media and stop supporting them. Or, I don't know, start a private blood feud with them. It's totally fine to dislike and stop supporting a person. But when that dislike starts to turn into something public, when we've crossed the line from private blood feud into public accusation, that's when we start to run the risk of actually outing an LGBTQ plus person. You then have to be okay with the cost of being totally wrong about a stranger's sexuality. And maybe you are okay with that, but you better be absolutely certain that you are not wrong. Because the cost of being wrong is badgering an LGBTQ plus person who does not feel comfortable or safe or ready to publicly come out and forcing them to come out to the public. The cost of being wrong is alienating an LGBTQ plus person from their own community, a community that should be a source of joy and pride. And that brings us to Kit Connor. Kit Connor plays Nick Nelson in the Netflix adaptation of Alice Oseman's graphic novels Heartstopper. Though he's been acting for over a decade, he was thrust into an international spotlight when Heartstopper aired. And predictably, that spotlight brought a legion of fans, millions of followers on social media, and increased scrutiny. In many ways, Kit got classic teen heartthrob treatment. He's the romantic lead in a popular teen series. He's got a boyish handsomeness going on for him. And with a decade in the industry, he's traditional media savvy. He comes across as charming and witty and articulate in interviews. Really, the second he was cast as Nick Nelson, he was destined for this sort of heartthrob status and the increased attention into his personal life that comes with it. But the increased attention he's gotten is not quite the same as Leo in the 90s, or Zac Efron, or Justin Bieber, or hell, even Noah Centineo in his Netflix rom-com era. Because unlike those guys, Kit Connor entered the international stage playing a bisexual character in a same-sex relationship. And so, on top of all the general scrutiny that comes from being an object of teenage affection, he has also had to deal with a barrage of public inquiries into his sexuality. Now, it's totally normal to be curious about the sexuality of actors playing queer characters. In particular, Heartstopper had an open casting call, and in that open casting call, it made clear that it was looking to cast authentically. It specifically highlighted the sexualities of its characters and asked LGBTQ plus performers to be encouraged to apply. Couple that with some of the statements by the creators and casting directors, it's really not a surprise that people were interested in the sexualities of the cast. And the cast does include many openly LGBTQ plus actors. So Kit Connor, who had not labeled his sexuality, did have to deal with a bunch of questions on the topic of his sexuality while doing press for the show. But the thing is, you know who understood that it was normal to be curious about the sexuality of the actors? Kit Connor. 18-year-old Kit Connor, who answered again and again with grace and respect and empathy questions about his sexuality. Quote, "I completely understand the idea that fans want authentic queer representation and therefore would ideally like to know the sexuality of who's playing the role. I completely agree that authenticity is something that should be strived for." That's a very different response than some celebrities who've answered the same question with things like, "Who cares?" or "It's not important." Answers that either lack empathy or betray a willful ignorance. But Kit didn't give those answers because Kit understands who cares, queer people, and that it can indeed be important for them. And so through all the Heartstopper press junket, he repeatedly displayed that understanding while declining to publicly state and publicly label his sexuality. In one such instance, he said, "If I haven't said anything, you shouldn't assume anything. But you also shouldn't pressure me to tell people. It's a very personal journey that people have to go on." He told the public time and time again that he understood why people were interested in his sexuality, but that he was not comfortable giving it to them. And if there's something the LGBTQ plus community should be able to understand, it's the feeling of not wanting to come out to the whole world. In particular, if you're an 18-year-old who's maybe still on their own personal journey. Kit was just 16 when casting for Heartstopper began. He was 17 when the show filmed and only 18 when it aired, and he had to field these questions. Nobody owes anybody else their sexuality, but especially not a teenager. Unfortunately, Kit's answers weren't good enough for some people, who almost immediately accused him of queerbaiting. These are people who saw that Kit was playing Nick Nelson, a popular bisexual character. These people assumed Kit was straight because he seems like he likes sports and takes gym selfies? And if taking gym selfies makes you straight, then truly, I don't know why the entire world assumes Kit is straight. I'm sure it has to do with stereotypes and homophobia. But for many, the fact that he would not publicly identify himself as queer was proof enough that he was queerbaiting. Kit first addressed these accusations in a somewhat snarky tweet. Quote, "Twitter is so funny, man. Apparently some people on here know my sexuality better than I do." In an interview, he elaborated on this a bit. "That tweet I posted pressed the importance of respecting people's own journeys. And I think it highlights the risks of outing someone and making someone feel uncomfortable. And because Kit is more thoughtful and well-spoken at 18 than I have ever been in my life, here Kit is just very clearly laying out the risks of accusing someone of queerbaiting. You make someone feel uncomfortable and you risk outing them." But despite Kit almost explicitly asking people not to out him, the accusations continued, reaching a fever pitch when photos of him holding hands with Maya Rafiko, a co-star in an upcoming project, surfaced on the internet. These accusations eventually transformed into harassment against him and many of those involved in the production of Heartstopper, trying to, quote, cancel Kit Connor. This entirely shitty situation culminated in the only way it could have, truly the most shitty way. With Kit tweeting, "Back for a minute, I'm bi. Congrats for forcing an 18-year-old to out himself. I think some of you missed the point of the show. Bye." And so Kit Connor came out as bisexual, but not on his own terms. On the terms of a vocal mob of people on social media, either too divorced from reality to understand that their actions can harm real people, or too callous to care. Let's be clear, no one ever owes you their sexuality, and this type of targeted harassment is never justified. But it's particularly unwarranted here, because even if Kit were straight, so what? What's the harm? Prior to coming out, he had spoken thoughtfully about LGBTQ plus issues while constantly uplifting and spotlighting the out queer members of the cast. His portrayal of a bisexual teen has been almost universally praised for its authenticity, and his portrayal has served as positive representation for a lot of LGBTQ plus people and teens and people who are just questioning. At the very worst, he would have taken a role that could have been cast by an out queer actor. But even that's not a guarantee. Kit Connor didn't cast himself. But he's not straight, as he has now told us. So while those harms from queerbaiting were merely hypothetical, the harms to Kit Connor an actual person, are real. He and those around him were harassed on social media. I imagine he feels some sort of alienation from the portion of the community that did that harassing. And as he told us while it was happening, it made his own personal journey to understand his identity harder. But most importantly, he was forced to out himself to the public before he was ready. Coming out is hard. And in an ideal world, coming out should feel triumphant, the culmination of a lifetime of getting comfortable in one's own skin. It should be done to trumpets and fanfare, not under duress. Because LGBTQ plus people can feel trapped and isolated by their sexuality for so long. And coming out can and should be the public representation of when sexuality goes from being a tool of confinement to one of liberation. But that doesn't happen when the outing is just as forced as the closet felt. There is no liberation in having your coming out be dictated by others. And that's precisely what happened to Kit Connor here. He did not come out as bisexual because he felt ready. He came out to end harassment. And that sucks. As Kit's tweet said, it's particularly unfortunate and ironic even that this all stemmed from the fact that Kit Connor played Nick Nelson in Heartstopper. Because Heartstopper is a show entirely about letting its characters find themselves and be comfortable in their own identities. And Nick Nelson gets the perfect coming out scene. And a lot has been written about how it's the perfect coming out scene because everything his mom does and says is so perfect and understanding and shows that she has been listening. But it's also perfect because Nick only comes out after he is ready to. He comes out on his own terms. The show devotes the penultimate scene, the final scene between Nick and Charlie, to establishing that Nick Nelson is ready to come out. That's the climax of Nick's emotional arc. The moment of purest happiness between these two is Nick telling Charlie that he is ready to come out to other people. And it is. It is a perfect moment of celebration and joy and relief. That's the exact moment that Kit Connor and all LGBTQ plus people deserve. And one that Kit did not get. There have been so many incredible, wonderful, heartwarming, joyous public coming out statements by public figures. No one has to come out publicly ever. But if one does, it should be a celebration. Queerbaiting accusations have robbed Kit of that moment forever. But there's one more thing about coming out that Nick Nelson's journey in Heartstopper can tell us. Coming out doesn't happen all at once. And it can look a million different ways. Because while the final moment with his mom is the coming out scene that everyone talks about, Nick comes out over and over and over again in small and big and explicit and implied ways throughout the series. He comes out to Charlie and to Tara and to Darcy and to Elle and to Imogen in various degrees throughout the story before ever saying a word to his mother. With each of these actions, he invites more people in to see more and different parts of his authentic self as he is comfortable and ready without labeling his sexuality. These are important and necessary steps in his self-discovery, in becoming comfortable in his own skin, and steps that all LGBTQ plus people take to test the waters of their public identities. That includes, of course, Kit Connor. Because while Kit did not owe us his sexuality or his identity, he still has shared bits and pieces of himself. From liking a tweet that said he was fighting to beat straight allegations, to dropping that he had a crush on Hugh Grant in Notting Hill.
Yeah, great. It's the Hugh Grant audition, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, no, honestly, I have such a fat crush on Hugh Grant. Man.
Kit has already expressed some portions of himself in small, discreet ways before ever publicly labeling his sexuality. I can't pretend to know exactly what was in Kit's mind or what he intended with these statements and actions. But I do know and am very familiar with the mental war that LGBTQ plus people go through before making these kind of statements publicly, before dropping hints or references to their sexuality. So I can't know whether Kit intended these actions to be references to his sexuality, but I cannot imagine that they were entirely accidental. Because coming out isn't just one grand statement. It happens 1,000 times in a million small and big and implied ways. And for many people, it begins by a small admission to test the waters, to make sure they're ready, to see if the community they're jumping into is safe. So it's a shame then that these actions are the very same ones that often get accused as queerbaiting. In fact, there's only one person to whom Nick does not come out to on his own terms in Heartstopper. That's Tao. And why is that? Well, it's because Tao assumes Nick is straight because he likes rugby and that he is just leading on Charlie and pretending to be queer. Yeah, that's right. Basically, Tao accuses Nick of queerbaiting. It's a shame then that of all the empowering, important celebrations of the queer community that Heartstopper has, that this is what some fans felt appropriate to emulate. Unsurprisingly, Kit has said in multiple interviews that the character of Heartstopper he identifies with most is Nick. Just hearing the way he talks about Nick makes it so clear how well he understands the character and with it the community represented that he is portraying. The biggest part of Nick's story is his internal conflict, that mental turmoil that so many people experience, and even outside of sexual identity or things like that. It's about dealing with others' expectations and finding your own path. I can certainly relate to him in many ways, but especially in dealing with other people's expectations. For him, it's being a rugby player, and everyone assumes that he's this macho, straight, stereotypical rugby guy. And in the same way, I dealt with certain expectations of me as an actor. That journey of dealing with these expectations and learning to accept yourself, appreciate yourself, learn more about who you are, and to love yourself. That's something I can absolutely see in my life that parallels Nick's. It's so sad then that he was forced to deal with these expectations by coming out. I hope that, like Nick, the rest of that journey, the learning to accept yourself and appreciate yourself, learning about who you are and loving yourself, is better for Kit. I hope that he has what he and Heartstopper were able to provide to so many LGBTQ+ people: joy and comfort and community and a sense of belonging. His portrayal of Nick Nelson has given so much to the LGBTQ+ community. I hope he feels he's gotten that back. I hope every time he comes out from now on, it's on his own terms. He deserves that. We all do. So can real people queerbait? I don't really care. The term queerbaiting has become so charged and distorted that accusations of it are almost inherently unproductive. But real people can be outed. So wouldn't it be nice if we at least tried to minimize that risk? Because when Misha Collins asks a room full of people, who here is introverts, who here is extroverts, who here is bisexual, I think Kit Connor should have the choice of whether he raises his hand or not.